Welcome back to Curiosity Not Judgment with Birga and Gary.
How are you?
I'm well. I think this is the first time we've been back in person in a couple weeks.
Yeah, we've been traveling.
We have been. So glad to be back at your kitchen table and having some good conversation. And today we're going to address transitions.
How do we transition into that?
Simply, we just begin.
Okay.
There are all types of transitions that we could address. And you even asked me, what was I thinking of? What style of transition? And there's everything from, childhood into adulthood, adulthood into having to watch aging parents. We've touched on many of these subjects in past episodes, but just that concept of transition is really what I wanted to talk about, because it is very hard to make that mental shift when you're accustomed to something, whether it be, a job to retirement, a lifestyle,
Single to married.
Yeah, absolutely. Married back to single. Those transitions are very, very hard. And so I thought we could be curious about those together.
One of the things that strikes me when you say that is we all, I think, strive to kind of build a foundation, something that's kind of constant. I know that for me, it's things like I need to know where my hairbrush is. I need to know where all my stuff. I claim it's because if all that stuff is in order, it allows me to think the big visions. That's probably just a rationalization, but I think we all kind of tend to want at least parts of our lives to be very stable, because we know that the one thing constant about life is change.
Right.
And so we have to be ready for that change. And so the more things are stable in one area, from my experience, the more things are stable in one area of my life, the more I can adapt to change in other areas. If it's too many changes at once, it seems like chaos. I get overwhelmed.
Well, and we just even began the episode talking about traveling and talk about transition, right? You're going from your normal routine in your home to now establishing a new routine in whatever place that you find yourself. And if you're having to make multiple stops, it becomes very tiresome and wearisome, at least for me. Maybe some people so love the thrill of travel that it's not a big deal. But there is, a lot of validity to what you're saying about us really needing that foundation of routine. And when we have to transition into another location, it becomes something that you have to adjust to. Your brain's got to get over. Your sleep cycle may be different. You may be in a different time zone. You're dealing with different, toiletries as you wash your hair and your body. Whatever it is, it takes some adjusting.
Yeah, every time. And I have travel routines and home routines. And I try to carry over some of my good and solid, stable habits from home onto the road with varying success. I don't eat as well when I'm on the road. I have an exercise routine that I can do in a hotel room, but it's not necessarily something that I choose to do, given the different environment. And so you're right, everything changes. And I travel enough to where that's a big deal. I need to, if I'm gonna have a stability over a year and I'm traveling X days, weeks per year, then that has an effect. If it was once or twice a year, who cares?
Right. Well, so there are going to be the bigger transitions, more than just business travel or vacation travel. There's going to be the transitions that either you choose to make because you change career fields or your lifestyle changes, your life circumstance change, or there's, of course, the transitions that are forced upon you that you don't want to engage in, but you don't have anything that you can do to control that. And so let's ask some of those questions about how do we smooth the path as much as we're able through those times of transition. Let's begin with the ones that are thrust upon you that you don't choose. Maybe your company is downsizing and you get transitioned on out. How do we begin to navigate that really tumultuous time?
So if you believe, as I tell myself at least, and don't always act this way, that everything that happens to you is an opportunity, and something to look forward to and something to find joy in. And a good way to do that is to stay curious and ask questions about what could be the opportunities here that this affords me. What is the upgrade that I could be doing? What can I utilize this transition for to improve things in my life? I think I've said on this podcast before that I moved 18 different times by the time I went to college. That's not something I had a choice in. My dad, I'm a proud son of a naval officer, and he moved frequently at that time. They used to move people around every 6 months to a year and a half, sometimes 2 years. And so each transition was an opportunity. Now, not everybody in the family felt that way.
Right.
I had some family members who had a real hard time with that, especially trying to establish relationships that they knew were going to be taken away very soon. I did see it as an opportunity to try out new things, right, and new ways of being even. But sometimes the transitions come with special hardships that you're dealing with during the transition. So how do you make the most of a transition? How do you stay curious and not judgmental? How do you move through, and how do you make progress?
Yeah. I would imagine that the easiest, quickest response in terms of judgment to a transition, much like that, military moving, is this sucks. We have to do this all the time. I hate this. I'm uprooted constantly. It's very easy to make that snap statement, snap judgment. And to be curious really is, and I know we've touched on this again in the past, but part of your personality, and there's that excitement for change, that eagerness for change. But if we're talking about, the rest of us that are a little bit more resistant, really trying to bend our thinking to those questions of, what new opportunities am I afforded in this change? How can I reinvent myself? What new people am I going to meet? What new experiences am I going to get to participate in? Those are questions we have to sit on, and we have to be purposeful to ask. Otherwise, it's really easy to get steeped in that judgment of this is terrible.
I'm in a group that does a kind of a self-evaluation every once in a while. And part of that evaluation is, what do I want to stop doing? What do I want to start doing? What do I want to continue doing? A transition is a really good time for that. And when you talk about what do I want to continue doing, if you want some level of normalcy or stability in your life, you can find out if you were a belly dancer in the last place you lived, go find a belly dancing troupe in the new place you live. But it's a great opportunity to stop doing things that haven't been working for you and start doing things that you've always thought about maybe you'd like to do, that maybe the ultimate would be find something that you want to do and can do in this new location that you could not do in the old location. Snow skiing, or surfing, there's certain locations that afford certain things that you can do that you can't do anywhere else.
Right.
And maybe that's an opportunity to grow into something like that.
Yeah. If you live in the, Sahara Desert and then you move elsewhere that has mountains and snow, very different outlook for snow skiing. Well, so you and I have both had circumstances where, that forced season of change has come upon us. And there's probably examples you can think of in your own head when you've reacted poorly and you've kind of succumbed to the quick snap judgment way of thinking. And then seasons when you've been more curious and you've had success in navigating those next steps. And you're mentioning how you did as a child, moving all those times before college. But does it become much more difficult the older we get to transition? I'm guessing I already know the answer to this. Because we become a little bit more rigid and set in our ways.
Again, some of that stability in what we set out to do can be, rocked. The loss of a spouse, the going from single to married. I think, you hear this from people, especially who get married later in life. I had all these routines that I did, and now this other person wants to do different things, right? That's the classic. But what is it about? I think the thing about a transition is you've got to get out of the blame game. You can't say, well, especially in ones that are forced upon us. Of course, there's always a choice, but the choices have consequences. I could have run away from home.
Sure.
before as my family left and said, see ya. That would have had some pretty severe consequences, right? But I think getting out of the blame game of, okay, I'm blaming this other person for this circumstance, because that's not going to, it sounds good at the time. It might even be justified judgment or anger, but obviously that's not going to help you move forward. So getting out of that part of it and saying, oh, this is terrible, and I've got to make new relationships, all those kind of things. I think the sooner that you get out of that and into, okay, what are the opportunities, the better. But what are some techniques to do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm guessing that you've got some top of mind, and you've asked some very good questions about, new opportunities, new relationships. But, as we're talking about, those circumstances are very, very painful. You mentioned the death of a spouse. There's other, fires. We've got fires raging in our state right now. We're in New Mexico, and there's been hundreds of homes that have been lost to fires. There is nothing you can do to control that fire when it comes your direction. And then, we've got hundreds of families, hundreds of business owners that have now found themselves in a place where, they're having to start over. It is a transition forced upon them. How do you maintain a positive outlook and have a positive curiosity about the future?
And the cliche, and I've never gone through this before, so I can't even imagine that kind of pain of losing your whole house, right? But there is the rebuilding, and just as nature does, soon the forest starts sprouting again, and new growth comes, and there's new opportunities to direct that growth or do things differently. But first you've got to go through the grieving process. And this brings up a really good point. Any transition involves a grieving process, even a good one.
Yeah.
And we often think of grief as always bad, and often it is, but whenever you lose something, including the stable life you once had, or the different life you once had, or the different location you once had, or the different vehicle you once had, there is a grieving process. And now, sometimes it's quick and easy, sometimes it's painful and slow, but you have to go through all the stages. So being aware of what those stages are and going through it properly is probably a good thing, because I can tell you that for a large portion of my life, I would just go on whistling Dixie, and then something would happen later that would trigger those stuffed feelings that I did not grieve properly for in the last transition. And I think that's something we really need to pay attention to. It's okay to say, wow, I have lost this, and I need to properly grieve around this. I need to go through the anger, the denial, and the whole bit. And that might be a good place to start.
That's a really important thing that you bring up. And again, I know that we've touched on pockets of this over the last 25 episodes of our podcast, but yeah, there are things that have happened in the course of one's life. I can think of myself in this season. A transition has happened, not recognizing the need to grieve, and then something later on down the road triggers that emotional outburst or that response that catches you and everybody else by surprise, because you haven't walked through those steps appropriately. And so I'm glad that you brought that up. That's key.
The only problem with that, and I think I used to rationalize and say, well, maybe it'll just go away. And Stephen Covey used to say, unexpressed feelings never die; they just come forth later in uglier ways. And I think the challenge, or the issue, I guess, with not expressing feelings at the time and having them come forth later is you can't always control that. And it may hurt or damage a relationship or a situation that didn't have to happen, because if we could have dealt with them sooner. Now, if you don't like dealing with your feelings, this podcast is not going to convince you. But I will tell you that in my experience, and in the experience of many authors who've written books about this, you will go through the grieving process. Good transition, bad transition, or whatever transition, There will be something that is lost.
Mm-hmm.
That's the definition of a transition. There's something new and there's something old, and that old is no longer there. And if you don't go through those stages, it will come forth later, and it will be uncontrolled, and it will be in an uglier way, and it will have a negative effect on something. Basic fact. So wouldn't you rather go through it in a quiet time, in a time where you can deal with it in the proper setting, with the proper safety and support around you, with the proper resources? Or would you rather have it later in an uncontrolled manner?
As you were talking, I was trying to even think, like, what would an example be of grieving over a good transition? And I was racking my brain, and then something came to me just today that I read. As we record this, it's the very end of May, and it's graduation season. And I read a post by a mom who's got children just a little bit younger than mine, who, of course, is celebrating a graduation of their child, but in that, grieving the loss of the kid component of their child.
Yep.
And there is something that happens in that transition, and maybe especially for a mom, I don't know, maybe for dads too, but you're kind of losing that grip on being able to have that level of influence and oversight of your child because you're now turning them over to adulthood. So while it's a celebration of transition from kid to adult, there is a grieving that has to take place because your role has changed in it.
Your role and your relationship, and that the kid with the wondering eyes that used to ask the incessant questions, and now your total interaction with them is fine, right?
Yeah.
And so there is a loss, and there's seasons, and the whole world is set up in seasons.
Yep.
Right? And there's seasons in nature, there's seasons in our lives, there's seasons in childhood. And those seasons, they, no matter what you do to prevent them, guess what?
They come.
Every time.
Yeah. I don't know if I've shared this story on this podcast. I know you know this about me, but one of the most impactful teachings that I had heard that launched me into a transition was a teaching called Necessary Endings. And as I heard that, I really got this aha epiphany about, I was at the time leading a nonprofit that was really struggling financially. And after hearing that and thinking and contemplating and doing some kind of deep soul searching, I came to the conclusion that it was time for a necessary ending for this nonprofit. But my goodness, was that a painful transition. I felt like I had failed on many, many levels. I knew that, the closure of this chapter was going to open up a new one, but I didn't know what the new one looked like. So there was grieving, there was anxiety about what comes next, just the general fear of the unknown, and then just all the shame and all the other emotions that get piled in there because, I was a catalyst for this change. And boy, there are those transition times that, when you look back, maybe you begin to see after a number of years, okay, I see the benefit that's come, but it might take a whole lot of perspective to get to that point where you can look back and see it with a positive outlook.
I think that's the prayer. That's the wish that people have, or that is one of my goals anyway, and that is to be able to enjoy a transition in the moment. Because oftentimes, every time in my life, when I look backwards, I see why that transition was necessary. I see that it led to something better, and I see the positive benefit for my life and others around me. But boy, it doesn't feel like that when you're in it.
Nope. It hurts when you're in it. And it's hard to stop to ask the questions. But I'm so thankful that I've had enough of those that now at least my instant reaction isn't necessarily one of the sky is falling and my world is over. Hopefully at least I can pause long enough to ask the one question of like, okay, what good could come out of this? And then hopefully that will cause me to cycle through some of the other questions to enjoy the moment of transition instead of loathing it.
I hope that I'm getting both older and wiser. But I do sometimes think that some people think, well, yes, I'm 25, but I know everything now, and I've got my degree, and I'm ready to go. And the difference in the length of time is not that you're a better person because you've lived longer. It's because you've had more experiences. You've had more transitions. You have that perspective that, you know what, this has happened, but you know what, it's going to be okay at the end. Because when you're younger, when you don't have that perspective, it can feel literally like the sky is falling.
Well, and it's very hard to take counsel from somebody, who says, "Oh, just weather through this. You're going to be okay," because you don't have a barometer for what's coming. Yes, you can hear and maybe receive a fraction of counsel from somebody who's been through it before, but much of the time you just have to experience it yourself.
That's right.
And I think as parents, we've all seen that firsthand as we try to speak wisdom into our kids about a transition they're walking through, and they don't heed it because really the lesson comes as they do it themselves.
And that is one of the big things in transition, and as you're trying to help others in transition, which is a natural next step in this, is helping them with that perspective. And you can't do it by saying, "Oh, I know exactly how you feel."
Right. Yeah, that never helps.
That never helps, because everybody will say, "No, you don't." And legitimately. I mean, you can walk a mile in another person's shoes, and before you try to speak to them, but your experience will still be different.
Right.
Their experience is unique, and trying to tell them that you know exactly what they're going through and exactly how they feel is just not true, and it gives them a point to argue, and that's not where you're trying to go. So, hey, I'm here to go through this with you.
Yeah.
Helps a great deal.
Yeah.
Usually, unless they blame you for the transition, right? Or, hey, I'm willing to help you talk through this if you'd like, or I'm willing to brainstorm a list of activities or things to try or things to do, or I'm willing to drive with you or drive you around to do this or that, or whatever I think is really good ways to help people through transitions. But not leading with, "I know exactly what you're going through, here's what you should do."
Sure. I mean, and even if the circumstance seems to mirror one another, maybe you've both experienced the death of a spouse, or you've both experienced a home fire, right? The way that the individual person feels is going to be vastly different from the way that the other person feels, because they have their own life and life experiences and stories. But perhaps, rather than leading with, "I know how you feel," should be something like, "Hey, if you ever want to talk about some of the things that were helpful to me when I went through this season or a season similar, I'd be happy to have that conversation." Because again, you're spot on. When you come out front with that judgment statement, "I know how you feel," the instant rebuttal is, "No, you don't," and then conversation is shut down from there.
Yeah, and that is a judgment, and way to bring that back, because the judgment is, and it is a judgment on my part to say, "I know how you feel," but I'll never forget when my dad came over the first time after I lost my spouse, and he had lost his spouse, and he didn't come over and say, "Hey, I know exactly how you feel." He came over and said, "Hey, here's some of the things that are going to have to happen. Here's some of the things that you're going to need to take care of that I learned the hard way. And I'm not telling you what order to do them in,
Right.
but here's a list. And some of them I would have never thought of, go down to the DMV and cancel the license because somebody's going to read the obituary and go try to go get a duplicate license, and just things like that, practical things. But it was also here's a couple of books that helped me. I'm not telling you to read them. I'm just saying here they are. Here's some other things that were helpful to me during this time. There are grief groups, when you're ready. But it was not prescriptive. It was descriptive of kind of stones along the path, or things along the way that are gonna that you might encounter, which is very helpful, because at that time, I was just reeling,
Sure,
and trying to figure out what's next. And for someone to come along and say, "By the way, here's some things that you're going to need to do or deal with at some point," was extremely helpful, especially when they didn't say, okay, here's the things you need to do tomorrow
Right.
or right now, right? It's just, here's some things that are going to have to happen. And I think that's instructful too. You know, the military does a really good job of helping families move. And they've got really good transitions and resources for exactly that, because they know that they've got a population that they're doing this too.
Sure.
Right? And so they had wonderful resources for that. And you knew exactly where to go when you got to a new base. Here's what to do. You know, I often thought about the poor civilians who didn't have that when they went to a new city.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so a couple good takeaways then for today. You know, if you're going through transition, take the time to grieve. Even if it's a good transition, as we mentioned, you know, there's a celebration for a new milestone. There's something in that transition that likely is now going to be removed. And so take the time to grieve. Look for available resources. And, you know, don't go in there with a judgment of like, oh, they can't possibly understand me because my situation is unique. Yes, it is unique, but maybe there are some common understandings that can help you get through that season. And then conversely, if you're the person trying to help somebody going through transition, to avoid leading with the judgmental statement, oh, I know how you feel. Begin to ask some of those questions about what benefits might we discover through this period of transition, and take the time to sit on those questions, to contemplate them, and even in really painful circumstances, to see, is there some silver lining ahead to ways that you could look at life differently, because life will be different.
And what opportunities does this circumstance afford?
Yeah, absolutely. As always, love to hear your feedback, your questions, your comments, your concerns. You can find ways to contact us on the Curiosity Not Judgment website. And of course, you're welcome to leave a message on any of the platforms where you are viewing or hearing this. So thanks so much for your time, and we'll see you next week.
Take care.